Hello, this video is about the rise of Asia. This is basically the most talked upon topic in international relations now and in the past 10 years. And what it simply means is the assumption that China, and to a lesser extent, but also importantly, India, are basically entering a new stage in their position in the international arena, whereby they are by far more powerful than they used to be in the last 100 years or so, even in the last 10 or 20 years of their major economic growth. I like to add another point, which is perhaps more social and more individual. It simply means the rise of Asia is that the percentage of the people in China and in India and in other Asian countries that will evolve socially into their own societies to become middle class with the disposable income of an international middle class becomes higher and higher. And therefore, that in general, these countries, China, India, and others in Asia, move from being the major producers of many products in the world to being major consumers in many industries, increasingly also luxurious industries or industries of luxury. An immediate question that comes to mind, of course, after that is, does the rise of Asia correspondingly mean a decline in the West or of the West? It's debatable. It also has to do with how you see international relations, whether as a zero-sum game, that if I win something, it means that you lose it, or potentially there is a win-win. But irrespective of philosophy and economic thinking, long story short, certainly the rise of Asia, increasing wealth in Asia, will mean on a macro level that Asian countries, such as China, India, and others, will certainly over the next 5, 10, 15 years get better trade terms than they used to have, whether in the past 10, 15 years or today. It also means that the disposable income of the middle classes in these countries will in general rise, the number of people in the middle classes will increase, and therefore not just that their ability to buy many products, including luxurious products, will increase, but in addition to that, their tastes, their wants, their desires will increasingly become the decisive ones in many industries. Now, does that correspond to a decline, or does that mean a decline in the West or of the West? It depends how you see it, but it's certainly a rise and strengthening in the East. You have some observers who basically put this whole rise of the East into a much more long-term perspective, and they say, well, we have basically entered the Asian century. Now, I personally dislike these terminologies because nobody knows what will happen after 5 years, let alone after 50 or 70 years. But what is certainly undeniable is that we have now, for the past at least 10 years, have seen the rise of Asia, and to some extent weakening of the West manifested in front of us, specifically since the financial crisis of 2008. Because over those roughly 10, 12 years, what has actually happened is not just that the financial system, primarily in the West, became very clear that it has many serious foundational and structural problems. But more than that, the austerity programs that were launched effectively all across Europe and the US, the West, have certainly eaten into some of the basic services that were taken for granted for many decades in these societies, specifically in Europe. And number two, the overall difficult economic circumstances that became the norm in many Western countries already diluted a lot of the political norms, givens that were in the West, at least in the last half century. And that obviously manifested itself in the rise of not just the right, but the far right, often in many countries, not at the margins of the West, but at the core of the Western Bloc. Now, if you assume that all of these trends, in a way, weaken the West from inside, and on the other side, you do have a subtle, slow, but steady rise in the East, does that mean that we are certainly going to see a confrontation between the rising powers in the East, primarily China, and more or less the relatively declining powers in the West, primarily the United States? You find many people say that is inevitable. I personally think it's not inevitable because it will depend on two things. It will depend on whether the assertiveness that we are seeing economically from China and from India will translate into political assertiveness, meaning that anybody who follows the policies of President Xi Jinping in China, Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India, and other leaders in Asia do see clearly in the last 5 years or so that the two countries, China and India, but also other players, as I said, in Asia, are increasingly seeking very clear economic benefits for themselves, not just in their neighborhood, but in the global economy. The question again, will that over the coming 3-5 years translate into assertive political demands in their neighborhood and potentially beyond? The view that says not necessarily stems typically from a standpoint that says that in both countries, whether in China or in India or in other countries in Asia, there are so many social problems, some would say political problems, that we need to be tackled and addressed before these countries dream even of standing up for big positions or demands on the international arena. And therefore, in this line of thinking, no, neither China nor India will really challenge the global order, more or less orchestrated, some would say run, by the United States, because they have a lot of issues to deal with at home. On the other hand, the view that says, no, actually, there is likely to be a translation of the economic assertiveness into political assertiveness comes from the view that says, historically, it has always happened. Whenever you have a country started to become much richer, having by far more favorable trade agreements with other countries, by far able to produce more, its middle classes rise and expand and demand more, it needs more access to markets, to resources. Basically, that naturally results in more assertive political stances or basically demands from other countries. And therefore, in that line of thinking, if we expect economic assertiveness, or if we see already economic assertiveness from China and India, inevitably that will lead to political assertiveness from the two players on the international scene. I think any attempt at really forecasting whether it will be the first view that the two countries will have a lot to contend with internally, or the second view that both countries, or at least China, will be tempted by its economic power to demand more and become more politically assertive on the global arena, very difficult to predict, almost impossible to predict. Too many variables, whether internally or internationally. But the two views are worthy of thinking about, keeping in mind, if we are thinking about the idea of the rise of the East. But the other question, which I think is equally important, is what will the response of the West, and especially the United States, going to be in either case, whether the economic power of the East is translated into political assertiveness, or if the Asian powers rise economically but more or less keep their political assertiveness at home within their own borders. In either case, how will Europe, how will the United States react? Here, I think the distinction between Europe and the United States is important, because what the United States sees in the rise of Asia, and specifically China, is very different than what Europe sees in the same situation. America, obviously, as the supreme sole superpower in the world in the last 25, 30 years, sees by far more serious change in the world, challenge, if you'd like, to its global position than how Europe sees the rise of Asian powers. And therefore, here, condensing the United States and Europe into one entity, and that is the West, to my mind, is very simplistic. Here, to think about the response to the rise of Asia, you must distinguish between America and Europe, because not just they see the rise of Asia differently, their interests are different in regard or with regard to dealing with China and India. So to summarize, I think thinking about the rise of Asia is key to thinking about how will the international relations arena be in the coming 5 or 10 years, if not the coming 20, 25 years. But for being realistic, let's only think about the foreseeable future, 10 years or so. The rise of China and India in particular is a crucial question here. But not just the rise economically, that's a given today, not just that is already translating itself as assertive economic powers in the world, but whether that economic assertiveness will evolve into political assertiveness, big question. And number two, how will the West, the United States and Europe respond to that? And in my view, it's not about finding an answer, because predictions are a bit silly, I think, given the variables in the picture, but rather how you see or how you address the question from different perspectives.